Be'ezras Hashem, with Hashem's help, we begin today a new set of laws. Hilchos Sha'ar Avos Hatumos, the laws of the remaining primary sources of impurity. Just for different constraints, today's class and the class afterwards, where we're going to pre-record for tomorrow for Shabbos, is going to be in a different location than it usually is, but the equipment is the same and the pictures will be the same, God willing. What is this set of laws about? Throughout this book, we've come to encounter different degrees of impurity. The corpse, that was the first one, he's kind of onto a category unto himself. He's called Avi Avos Hatuma, the father of the fathers of impurity. It's like the grandfather of impurity. But typically we deal with what's called Av Hatuma and Vlad Hatuma. Av Hatuma means a primary source of impurity. Those are the things that are clearly mentioned in the Torah that communicate impurity at a high level. We've had some already. Tzaras is a Av Hatuma. Mitame Mishkav U'Moshav, the whole last set of laws, are Av Hatuma. The Mishkav U'Moshav themselves, that which the Zav sits on or lies on, itself becomes an Av Hatuma. But then we had also what's called Vlad Hatuma. Vlad means literally a baby, in contrast to Av, which is a father, but it basically means lower degrees of impurity. We have the Vlad is split into multiple categories: Rishon L'Tuma, Sheni L'Tuma, Shlishi L'Tuma, Revi L'Tuma, as actually we're going to explore at length in this set of laws. We've just come across them in passing in earlier sets of laws, but it's actually coming here, the full gamut of that. The core difference between an Av Hatuma and a Vlad Hatuma is in its power to transmit impurity. An Av Hatuma, typically, as the Rambam told us way in the beginning of this book, has the power to transmit impurity not only to food or drink, but also to people and to utensils. A Vlad Hatuma, the hallmark signature of a lower degree impurity is the fact that it cannot transmit its impurity further to people or to utensils, only to food or drink. And within that, there's different degrees, different types of food or drinks, truma, sacrificial meat, as we're going to explore in this set of laws. So we've had a chance to deal with multiple different types of Av Hatumas. In this set of laws, we're going to be dealing with not one specific topic, but all the remaining Avos Hatumas, all the remaining types of things that are primary sources of impurity, which the Rambam will list actually in the mitzvahs in the beginning of these laws. Interestingly though, the rest of the halachas are not all about that. It's 20 chapters. It's going to be for 3 weeks on this topic. Each of the Avos Hatumas that we're going to be discussing here gets a couple of chapters, but then it's actually going to segue into discussing Vlad Hatuma, into discussing the varying lower degrees of impurity, as well as all the rabbinic impositions within the laws of purity and impurity. Different Avos Hatumas that were imposed by the rabbis, which you've actually also had a chance to meet some of them in previous sets of laws, things that act as an Av Hatuma midivrei Sofrim, rabbinic primary sources of impurity, and also many of the other rabbinic impositions in the areas of Tumah V'Tara, especially as it pertains to what's called sveikos, doubts that arise in laws of ritual impurity. Have a whole section of chapters that deal with how do we relate to them. That's going to be also covered in this set of laws. That's really where we're heading in Hilchos Sha'ar Avos Hatumos. So, as the Rambam always does, he gives us the list of mitzvahs that we're going to be discussing in this set of laws. Yesh bichlolon shalish mitzvahs aseh. There are included in the set of laws 3 positive mitzvahs. V'zehu pratan, these are their details. Aleph, din tumas nevela, the laws of impurity that apply to a carcass. That's how we're going to translate nevela, a dead animal. It has more specific definitions, as we're going to see in the first 3 chapters. That's what we'll call it. A dead animal imparts impurity, and all the laws governing that is a mitzvah. Beis, din tumas sheretz, the laws that govern the impurity of a rodent. There are specific 8 types of rodents mentioned in the Torah that have a specific type of impurity, which we're going to learn about. Gimel, din tumas shichva zera, the law of the impurity imparted by semen. And the Rambam already mentions now, gives us a little hint of what's coming, va'avodah zara metama kasheretz. Idols communicate impurity like rodents, bitum asam midivrei sofrim, but it's a rabbinic concept. They're a rabbinic av, rabbinic primary source of impurity, and we're going to be discussing that as well. And then it's going to segue into all the rabbinic laws related to impurity, which we haven't yet covered. Ubir mitzvahs elu b'prakim elu, the explanation of these mitzvahs is coming in the following 20 chapters. So let's get right into it. Perek Rishon, chapter 1, we begin with halacha aleph, hanevela. The Rambam says, a carcass of a dead animal, av me avos hatumos, is one of the fathers, one of the primary sources of impurity. As we're going to see, nevela has a very specific definition, depending on whether it's a kosher animal or a non-kosher animal in question. If it's a non-kosher animal in question, then a nevela means a non-kosher animal which died in any way, shape, or form. No matter how it was killed. Killed naturally, died on its own, slaughtered, ripped apart, makes no difference. If it's a kosher animal, it's specifically referring to an animal which died in a way other than shchita. Shchita is the proper ritual slaughter as prescribed by the Torah. If a kosher animal is slaughtered properly, then it becomes pure. The dead animal does not communicate impurity. It's not called a nevela. It's called shchuta, an animal which is slaughtered. Nevela means a kosher animal which died in any other way than the prescribed method of slaughter, or a non-kosher animal that died in any way. And we're going to explore in today's chapter which parts of the animal are considered to be a nevela. Primarily it's the meat of the carcass, but the Rambam will address many other parts of the animal when they're considered part of the nevela and they communicate impurity, and when they don't. But first, the basic rules of nevela in terms of impurity. Hanavela, says the Rambam, avmi avos hatumos, it's a primary source of impurity, which means kezayis mi basara. If you have an olive-sized volume of its flesh, mitame adam v'kelim b'maga, it can communicate its impurity to people and utensils if they come into contact, direct contact with it, which is a hallmark of an av. Once you're a vlad, once you're a lower level, you cannot do that. Uklecheres ba'avir, they also can communicate impurity to pottery utensils when they enter the airspace. That's the unique law of pottery utensils. They only contract impurity if you go into their airspace. And being an av, a nevela can do so. Additionally, a feature unique to a person, a nevela can make a person impure if the person carries the nevela. So maga, contact, applies to both people and utensils. Masa, carrying, only applies to people. More so, when a person carries a nevela, there's an even stricter level of impurity imposed upon him than when he touches it. And that is called litame begodim. The fact that he becomes impure, not just to make himself impure, but also to communicate the impurity to whatever he's wearing, and any other utensils that he touches at the time of carrying. As we had a similar concept, kemerkav hazav, when it came to things that the zav rides on. In the last set of laws, the Rambam told us that one of the features of merkav, things that a zav rides on, is that while it will communicate impurity to whoever touches it, if you're just touching it, you don't become a conductor of impurity to anything else. But once you're carrying it, you become a conductor of impurity, and while you're carrying, you touch something else, that impurity gets communicated through you to that object. As the Rambam presently describes, as it relates to nevela. Ketzad, what does this mean? How do we explain the difference between touching and carrying when it comes to nevela? Adam shenaga b'nevela. Let's say a person touched a nevela. So there he is, that's the carcass, and he's touching it. Nitma. So he becomes impure. Since the nevela is an av, whenever impurity transfers from one entity to another, it goes down 1 degree. The person who touched the nevela becomes first degree impurity. But since it's only touching that we're dealing with, if he touched other utensils, even while he's touching the carcass simultaneously, he doesn't become a conductor. The utensils remain pure. In fact, even the clothes that he's wearing stay pure. Lefishahu vlad, because he, having received impurity from a father, primary source of impurity, becomes what's called a vlad, a baby, first degree, lower degree impurity. Ve'ein vlad, and a vlad cannot transmit impurity to any other utensils. But a special law applies to somebody carrying a nevela. That what? While he's carrying the nevela, if he then touches utensils, he transmits the impurity to the utensils. And this we know from a special verse. Shenemar says in the pasuk, "V'hanoisei nivlasa," one who carries their carcasses. In context, it's talking about animals that I was just talking about before. A person that carries the carcasses of an animal, yechabes begadav, he needs to wash his clothes. And we learned in the last set of laws that whenever Torah uses the word yechabes begadav, it means not only do I become impure, but also the clothing that I'm wearing becomes impure, which means that I become a conductor for impurity. And the clothes become, like you, first degree impurity, first level of vlad. Now the Rambam adds that this special law of becoming a conductor when you're carrying a nevela only applies to other utensils. You don't transmit your impurity to other people or to other pottery utensils, even if you're still carrying the actual nevela. As we explained when it came to the laws of those that transmit impurity to the things that they lie on and they sit on. Halacha base. Now that Rambam defines which types of animal are called a nevela, which I already spoiled for you in the introduction. Echad behema v'chaya. Nevela applies, the impurity of nevela applies both to what we call behema and chaya. Behema is a domesticated animal. Chaya is a beast, a non-domesticated animal. The laws of nevela apply to both. As we're going to see, there's going to be one big core difference between the two. and that's the status of their fat, their chelev. But we haven't gotten there yet. First, we're talking about the meat. The meat of a dead animal is a nevela, whether it's a domesticated or non-domesticated animal, bein min hamutarin ba'achila, bein min ha'asurin, whether it's a kosher, permitted for consumption animal, or it's a non-kosher animal. Im mesu, if they died, kulan besaran betami b'kazayis, in all scenarios, their flesh transmits impurity with an olive-sized portion. Ushchitas behema tahira v'chaya tahira, but if you properly slaughter a kosher animal or a kosher beast, mitaheres oisa b'chol makan, wherever it may be, it makes it pure. Now it no longer has the status of nevela. And the Rambam says, "Va'afilu shachat chulin ba'azara v'kadashim b'chutz." Even if the slaughter which you happen to do is a sin for a different reason. For example, it's a non-holy animal in the temple courtyard, or it's a holy animal out of the temple courtyard, where you have other problems. You're going to get punished for doing that sin. But the slaughter itself was a kosher slaughter. Hare'elu tahidin. It's powerful enough to make these animals now pure in their dead state. They're not a nevela. However, v'im'eda psul b'shchita. If any disqualifying factor happened in the shchita, in the slaughter, a nevela, it becomes a nevela. It's an animal which died in a way other than proper ritual slaughter. As we explained in the laws of slaughtering, and therefore, mitama b'masa, it transmits impurity not only through contact, which is the classic way, but even the special way of carrying, which allows you to even become a conductor, as we explained before. Halacha gimel, behema tmeya v'chaya tmeya, non-kosher animals, domesticated or not. Slaughtering it makes no difference. It doesn't matter whether you slaughter it, or you tear it open, or you choke it, or it just dies of natural causes. In all scenarios, non-kosher animals are nevela. Interestingly, says the Rambam, with regards to impurity, all types of nevela combine to create the required olive-sized portion. Doesn't matter if it's kosher or non-kosher. It's an interesting contrast to the laws of non-kosher. In the Rambam's 5th book, when we were dealing with the prohibition to eat nevela meat, over there the Rambam says, if you have non-kosher nevela and kosher nevela, and you eat half an olive-sized portion of this, half an olive-sized portion of that, they don't combine to hold you liable for the punishment. But when it comes to impurity, you put them together, they do combine to create the requisite amount. Obviously, if we're talking about contact, you would have to touch both pieces or all the pieces at once to be considered to be touching a kazayas. But with regards to carrying, as long as they're all in one bowl and you carry them all, again, even if the olive-sized portion is being created from a conglomerate of kosher and non-kosher nevelas, you're still impure. Halacha dalid, now let's get to defining some of the body parts of the nevela and see which ones classify as meat and are therefore impure, and which ones are not. Moyach harehu kebasar. The first thing is, marrow inside bones is considered like meat, and it transmits impurity of nevela. Whereas v'dam ha-nevela, the blood inside of a dead animal, does not transmit impurity like a nevela. Rather, we treat it like impure liquid, which biblically cannot transmit impurity further to people or utensils. In other words, what we look at is as if the blood and the meat are two distinct entities. The meat is an av, it's a primary source of impurity. The blood touched the meat, so like anything which touches an avatuma, it becomes a risha in the tumah. That's the law. When you have non-kosher, when you have liquid that touches an avatuma, the liquid becomes a rishon. But because it's a rishon, it cannot transmit its impurity further to any other people or utensils. So it's in that way, it's not like the nevela itself, the blood. Halacha hey, chelev, when it comes to fat, now we have a very interesting difference between a behema and a chaya, between a domesticated and a non-domesticated animal. Now, as we're going to see, this difference only applies within kosher animals. When we're in the realm of non-kosher animals, it makes no difference. But we're about to learn a difference within kosher animals itself, between behema and chaya. It says that Rambam chelev behema tohira shemesa. If it's a domesticated animal in question, a cow, okay? So you have a cow, the cow died, and you want to know what the status of the fats inside that cow are. It says that Rambam toher. Interesting, they are pure. They're not considered to be nevela and transmitting impurity. How do we know this? Shenemar, it says in the verse, v'chelev nevela, v'chelev treifa, ye'asa l'chol malacha. The fats of a nevela and the fats of a treifa, a mortally wounded animal, can be used for any work. While the verse concludes you can't eat it, but it can be used. It can be used means, as the commentaries and the sages interpret it, it doesn't transmit impurity. Now, this verse, first off, is only being said about kosher animals. How do we know that? Because the Torah says, v'chilev nevela, v'chilev treifa, which means, misha isurei mishum nevela o treifa. We're only talking about animals whose whole prohibition is the fact that they are a nevela and a treifa. If it's a non-kosher animal, you have other issues. You have issues of it being non-kosher. Torah singles out nevela o treifa to tell you that this special law of fats not being considered impure is only if it's a kosher animal in question. The way we know, by the way, that it's not talking about a undomesticated animal is because the Torah forbids the eating of the fats. And if you can remember all the way back to the laws of forbidden foods, fats are only forbidden in a behema, not in a chaya. So when the Torah differentiates here between eating and using, it has to be a kosher behema, a kosher domesticated animal. That said, even though fats are by default pure, completely pure, not even like the blood is arisha natuma, the fats is totally pure. Nevertheless, if it comes into contact with any of the liquids that make something susceptible to impurity, this is going to be in the next set of laws, a whole thing on this. Anything that's attached to the ground or to its original source of life isn't even susceptible to becoming impure. Once you pick fruit off of the ground, now they become susceptible if they come into contact with one of the 7 liquids recognized by the Torah. Wine, blood, water is the classic one. Oil is different ones. So these fats, they're not impure on account of nevela. But if they come into contact with liquid, then they're going to be treated like classically impure foods. But we're still not going to treat them as nevela. In other words, they don't ever enter the arena of being a nevela. They're subject to all other laws that govern foods in terms of impurity. But nevela, no. The Rambam addresses a very specific part of the fats now. What if somebody touches the fats that cover the kidneys before you remove them? So, I researched this a little bit. You can find on YouTube many fascinating videos. This is an animal kidney after all the fats have been removed. This is a kidney before the fats have been removed. And here it's actually split open, but if you would fold that together, you'd basically see that the kidney is completely covered in fat. Completely. Now the kidney, as we're going to see tomorrow, clearly the Rambam says, the kidney is considered to be meat. So it has the impure status of nevela. Fats, we just said from a behema, doesn't have the status of a nevela. The question is, what if you touch the fats that's covering the kidneys? Is that considered touching fat or meat? It says the Rambam, touching the fat of the kidneys is like touching the kidney itself. And the reason for this is because of a rule we're going to mention a little later today, but it's going to be explored also later in these laws, what's called shomer. Shomer means a guard. Anything which is there to guard another product, if that product is subject to impurity, the guard is also subject to impurity. So since the fat serves to protect the kidney, touching the fat is like touching the kidney. Now there's one problem. The idea of shomer only applies if there's a possibility to touch the product that's impure directly. But in this case, the fat is covering the kidneys completely. So even if the fats are considered a shomer, by the laws of shomer, they shouldn't be able to communicate impurity. So the Rambam immediately clarifies, there are multiple strands of tissue that come out from the kidney through the fats, so that even on the outer layer of the fats, it's possible to touch part of the kidney itself. And therefore we can classify the fats as a shomer and transfer the impurity of the kidney to the fats themselves. And this would be an exception in which, even though usually fats are not impure on account of nevela, these fats are. But everything we just said is talking about kosher fat. Avos behema tmeya. But if it's a non-kosher animal, b'chaya bein tmeya bein teira, or if it's non-domesticated, we don't care if it's kosher or non-kosher. Echad besara ve'echad chelba letuma. Both its meat and its fats are in the same category with regards to impurity. Or metame adam v'kelim b'kazayis kibsara nevela. And if there's an olive-sized portion of fat, it transmits impurity to people on utensils, just like the meat of the nevela itself. Because, as we mentioned before, that whole verse which gives the dispensation for chelev is only talking about a behema, kosher behema, and not talking about a chaya. Halacha vav. What do we do with hakoi? This always comes up. The koi is an animal at the stages we're unsure about its status as a behema or as a chaya. So what do we do with its fat? Of course, when it dies, its meat is going to be a nevela. What will be the status of its fat? So out of stringency, we have to assume that it's a chaya and say that chelbei metame kibsare, its fat should communicate impurity like its meat. but since we're not sure, it might be a behema. Therefore, v'tumasei b'safek, the impurity is in doubt. And like any case of doubtful impurity, lefikach ein surfin alav truma v'kadashim. If that fat of this dead koi comes into contact with truma or sacrificial meat, typically, if a definite source of impurity touches truma or sacrificial meat, you have to burn it. In this case, because of doubt, we're not going to burn it. Similarly, if you become impure from this fat and you go into the temple or you eat sacrificial meat, typically if you're impure and you do that, you're liable to excision. Here you're not, because it's only a doubt. Halacha Zayin, we've discussed marrow, we've discussed blood, we've discussed fat. Let's discuss some more things. The following entities in an animal are typically not considered to transmit the impurity of nevela. And they are ha'atzamas, bones, va'karnayim, horns, va'atlafayim, and hooves, afilu ikran harach, even the part that's close, that's soft, closer to the body, that if you would cut it from a live animal, it would actually bleed. It doesn't matter. It's not considered part of the nevela for these purposes. The ha'oir, hides of the animal, even if it isn't fully tanned. The ha'alol and alol. Alol we're going to translate as loose meat. It basically means small pieces of meat that come along while you're skinning. With a skinning knife, by mistake, you dig into the meat and you pull off some pieces of meat that stay stuck to the hide. The hagidim, any sinews, the hamarok, the hatavlin, hamizbash limima, and any gravy or spices with which the nevela was cooked. Again, the nevela is not kosher. Let's say you cooked it in a pot with some gravy and sauce and spices. Those things are not considered to be impure with the same status as nevela. But Medvarim Amorim says that Rambam, when do we say this? That all these things are not considered to be nevela entities, bizman shepirshu min nevela, after they've been separated from the core animal. But if you touch any of these things when they're still attached to the meat of the nevela, you're impure as if you touched the nevela for the same reason we mentioned before of shomer. These are all considered to be protective elements to the animal, also known as yad, which is an accessory. They're an accessory to the animal, and therefore they transmit impurity like the animal does. Provided that in the meat that they're attached to, there's a volume of an olive-sized portion. Because none of these entities can be part of the olive-sized portion. You have to have an olive-sized portion of meat. That makes it classify as a nevela. Now you have these accessories. Now touching the accessories will make you as impure as touching the olive-sized portion. Halacha ches, we mentioned that the loose meat, the alol, is not considered a nevela. It says that Rambam ha'alol, when we talk about loose meat that was missed or attached to the hide, missed by the skinning, it doesn't matter ben shaplatatu sakin. It doesn't matter if it came to be because the knife missed it, ben shaplatatu chaya, or because the animal missed it. Let's say an animal dies, it becomes part of the food chain, right? Animals nearby come to eat it, they feast on it. When they're done, there may be some pieces of meat still stuck to the hide. That's also classified as alol, and it also doesn't transmit the impurity of nevela. It doesn't combine to the olive-sized portion, except v'im kinsai, if you gathered it in. Let's say you have a hide, bunch of loose pieces of meat, you gather them all in. Now you've shown that it has significance to you. Then, if it has an olive-sized portion, then it is going to be transmitting impurity like a nevela, classic nevela meat. Halacha tes, we mentioned before that hides, animal hides, are not considered to be part of the meat of an animal. But there are exceptions. The following are animals whose hides are treated like their meat. And when they die, the hides communicate impurity just like the meat does. The hide of a domesticated pig. Apparently it's softer, could even be eaten in some cases, so we treat it like meat. And the soft hump skin of a camel. We'll soon define what soft means. Some texts have the classic word chatoiteres, but here we have chatoiteres. The soft hump skin of an animal. The udder skin of a female animal. The hide of a fetus, an unborn fetus, is considered to be like meat. The soft hide under the tail. All these things are considered like the flesh, and they do transmit impurity when they're part of an avela. But once you process them, or you place them down, as was customary in those days, for people to trample upon, the time it takes to tan a leather hide, they are pure now. Now they've lost their meat status, they become regular hide without the capacity to transmit nevela impurity. Also, if you did an action which showed that you nullified them from being meat status, they become pure. Even if you didn't walk with them the time it takes to tan. What would be an example of this? Ketzad. How do we visualize this? A little gory, but you take an ear of a donkey, which is soft skin and typically should be treated like meat, and you use it to patch up a hole in a basket. So that's it. You're not going to use it for anything else. Tahira, it's now pure and is not going to communicate the impurity of nevela. Kamahu kedei abada. How much is the time it takes to trample on something to tan it? Arba'as milin. The time it takes to walk for meal. A meal is either between 18 or 24 minutes. So between 72 and 96 minutes is the time it takes to consider it trampled well enough that it's processed. What is the soft hum skin? As long as you never loaded a camel. A camel at a certain point grows to be the appropriate time to load it. And then when you load it, now it becomes considered hardened skin. But before you've loaded it, it's considered soft. What if What if it came of age to load it, but you didn't yet load it practically? Or you loaded it before it came the time. A suffix says that in this case it's a doubt whether it's still considered soft skin or now it's considered hardened skin and is no longer going to be impure. Halacha Yud, talking about skinning. Typically, even today, but for sure in the olden days, skinning was a very, very important part of the process of making use of an animal. And there were different ways to skin. There were different purposes that you would want the hide for. One purpose could be what's called shatiach, for a carpet. In this case, you would take a knife, go all the way down the center of the animal, and then pull it out so you have this carpet shape. Another case that you might need from skinning is more of like a flask. You needed the whole circumference. You couldn't cut down the center. So what you would do is you would cut it over here between the feet and then skin it downwards so that you ended up with the entire circular circumference. There was, as we're going to see, a very specific, talented type of skinning where you can skin the entire animal from just 1 foot. You make a cut over here, and they were able to somehow maneuver all the skin off from that 1 foot. So the Rambam now wants to talk about at what point does the hide assume its status of hide. Because of course, as we said, even in the animals whose hide is not considered like their meat, as long as the hide is still attached to the skin, to the meat, it has the status of the meat. At what point do we consider it separate in that now it's hide unto itself and not going to be impure? So the Rambam says it depends what you want the skin for. When somebody skins a carcass of an animal, or domesticated or not, whether it's impure or pure, kosher or non-kosher, or it's an ovine or a bovine, thick or thin, meaning cows or sheep, that kind of stuff. So we have to ask ourselves why or what way are you skinning it? If you're skinning for carpet, which means you're going down the center and you're going to peel it away, once you pull off enough skin that you can hold, which is an area of 2 by 2 handbreadths. If you touch that skinned hide, you're pure. At that point, the hide assumes its own identity. But before you skin that amount, touching the hide is like touching the meat. What if you skin it the other way to make a flask out of it, where you're cutting it only at the top over here, and you're going to peel it all the way down? Now the skin is considered to be attached to the meat for longer. Until you skin the whole chest area. That's what makes it significant unto itself. If you were doing the special, talented type of skinning, where you're going only just from 1 foot, the entirety of the hide remains considered attached. Touching the hide is akin to touching the meat. Until you get the entirety of the skin off of the meat, till you show your talent, show your professionalism all the way, then it becomes a separate entity from the meat. Same thing if a person skins rodents. It's considered attached to the meat until you fully remove the skin. Skin around the neck of an animal carcass. Because it protects the meat, it's considered attached till you remove it completely, no matter what you're using it for. In any scenario where we're talking about the hide is still considered attached with regards to transmitting impurity, at the same way, it also means that it's attached to become impure, which means, let's say it was an animal that was slaughtered properly, in which case it becomes pure from nevela. And then some other source of impurity touches the hide of this animal, while it's still considered halachically attached, nitma habasar, the entirety of the meat will become impure as well, because the skin and the meat are considered to be one unit. But if you reach the point where they're considered distinct entities, then an impurity touching the hide will not affect the meat. Halacha Yud Aleph Ershe Yeshalav Kazayas Nevela. You have a piece of hide, and attached to it is an olive-sized portion of nevela. Hanegea Bitziv Hayetze Mimenu. If some strand of hide splits off from the hide opposite the area of the meat, ubesayda shekenegdoi, or you touch a hair on the opposite side of the meat where the meat is attached to the hide, me'achayre in the back of the hide, nitma, you're impure. Mipnei sheha'or bisa'arai sheimer labasar. When hide still has hair on it, it's considered to be protecting the meat. And since the meat is an olive-sized portion, it's a significant amount, so the hide can be subservient to the meat. But that's only if the meat was attached to the hide because it was eaten up by an animal and the animal left that piece of meat. Avo platatu sakin, but if it's there because the knife missed it in the skinning process, if the kazayas of meat is flattened upon the surface of the flesh, of the hide, it doesn't have any independent status, and instead of the hide being subservient to it, it is subservient to the hide, and there's no impurity at all. Halacha Yud Beis Ershe Yeshalav Kishnei Chatzai Zeisim Besar Nevela. You have a piece of hide, okay, and attached to it is 2 half olive-sized portions, separately. Ha'er Mevatlan. The hide nullifies their status. Einan Metamin Le B'maga V'le B'masa. They don't have any sort of impurity, not touching them, certainly not because they're two distinct units, but even if you carry the whole hide, in which case you've carried an olive-sized portion of the nevela, still doesn't make you impure. Because there's no half and half. If you're not transmitting impurity through touching, you also don't have the impurity of carrying. But let's say you had a different way of connecting 2 half olive-sized portions. You put them both on a spit or on a stick. If you carry them together, you're impure. Because you carried a kazayas. But if you touch it, you're pure. Because the attachment made by people is not considered to be an attachment. Nevertheless, they can still continue transmitting impurity through carrying because they never become nullified. On the skin, they nullify to the skin. But over here, they have their own identity. But in this case of putting 2 half olive portions on a stick, they have to be stuck, crushed, and stuck to each other. So they can be moved as one. They're like one entity. But it's just one long skewer, and you have half an olive-sized portion here, half an olive-sized portion here. You can carry it all day. You're pure, because you never carried a full united entity of a kazayas. Yud Gimel Besar Nevela Shenifsad Vehivish. Animal carcass dies, the meat begins to disintegrate, decompose. The nifsal milecha lakelev. It became disqualified even for a dog. Even a dog won't get close to it. Tahar. At that point, it becomes pure, and it's no longer an avela. Lefikach, therefore, netzal hanavela. When you have these fluids that are oozing out of the body of an animal carcass, suffik imitame bikazayas ein imitame. It's a doubt if it does transmit impurity or not, because we're not so sure if a dog will eat it or it's considered like dirt, so we leave it in doubt. Besar nevela shayavash. Carcass meat that dried up, just hardened and dried. Im yachol lishres bepoishnin me'es le'es. V'lach zer lach. If you put it in warm water, you can soak it for 24 hours and it will become moist again, to the point, v'roy lekela, that a dog will eat it, metame, it becomes, or it's considered to be nevela meat, and it will make you impure. V'im lav, if not, tar, then it's pure. V'afilu ka'ichlin tmein metame. It isn't even like impure food. It's not food, it's just dried up, hardened, nothing. So it has no status of impurity whatsoever. Yudalid, besar nevela, shayasaruach me'ikarya. What if you have carcass meat that was decomposed to begin with? It means it decomposed in its lifetime. There was a sickness there, a disease. And it didn't decompose after death, it was just that way, that's the way it died. And nobody, it was not fit for human consumption. Then it's pure. Even if a dog could still eat it in this case. Shenemar, it says in the verse, when it talks about the prohibition to eat nevela, that a Jew cannot eat it. Rather, give it as a gift to the resident alien, the Gentile who keeps 7 Noahide laws in your area. Which means, that means that when it dies, it has to be able to be given to a ger. You wouldn't give a diseased, decomposed meat to somebody, so therefore it has no status of impurity for you. Tesvav shilya shel nevela, the placenta of a carcass. Is considered like waste, solid waste. It has no status of impurity like the nevela. But if you think in your mind that you're going to eat it, some people eat the placenta, it's a thing. Jews should not do it, absolutely not. But some people in the world, they do that. They say it's healthy for the mom after the birth, something like that. Then, since you've attached to it the status of food, now it could become impure, at least like food can become impure, but not nevela. Hakeva v'hechalav, however, the areas in the stomach where you would actually curdle milk, make it into cheese. The hachalav and milk itself in an animal system, shal nevela of a carcass, tohirin niklum, are completely pure. They're considered, according to the Rambam, like waste, not a nevela at all. So they don't transmit impurity. Tezayin behema sheshafa chararas dam, an animal which expelled or miscarried what looks like just a clot of blood, a blob of blood. Afal pisha niftara min abchera, even though it is considered a baby somewhat with regards to the laws of firstborn. That if it has a baby after it, it's not holy with the laws of bechor. Nevertheless, this blood clot is not going to be considered a dead animal for purity purposes. It will not make you impure touching it or carrying it. It has to have the form of an embryo somewhat. And the reason is because even if there is a baby inside this clot of blood, it's nullified in the majority of the blood, which came out with it. Therefore, it's pure, even though it does meet the qualifications. Had the animal died with it in its system, you could have gifted the whole animal to the ger, and it would have been fine. But nevertheless, right now, there's nothing here to consider an nevela, and so it's considered pure. You have a mixture. There's a bunch of dead animals. Some of them died of natural causes. Some of them were slaughtered properly. So nevela meat is impure. Shchuta meat is pure. What do? Usually the rabbis came with much more harsher requirements for nullification, 1 in 60. Here, we follow the biblical rule of bittul b'roiv, just the majority. If there's a majority of slaughtered meat, batla hanavela b'shchuta, the nevela meat is cancelled in the slaughtered meat. And none of it transmits impurity with touching. Interestingly, if you carried the whole pile of meat, let's say it wasn't animals, say it was just meat, you'd become impure because you for sure carried the nevela meat, wherever it is. Now, the reason why we rely on bittul b'roiv with regards to touching, because of the two, you have dead carcass and slaughtered meat. Slaughtered meat can never become nevela. Aval hanevela efshar shatitar kishatisrach, but nevela meat could become pure if it decomposes. So because anyways it's more leaning towards pure than impure, therefore we allow it in this case of mixture to become nullified, and if there's more shchuta than nevela, the whole thing is pure.